If you've been following along with all my coverage of the Necromancer and all the theory crafting and testing, etc. on stream and on YouTube, I have something very sad to report to you. I was completely wrong about something, and as such, I've accidentally been lying to you the entire time. Well, I really haven't been lying to you. In fact, I was right about the thing that I thought I was right about, but it's the assumptions that I made based off of that I was wrong about. You know what? Less talk. Let's just go ahead and get into it. So you might have heard recently that there's just been a ton of clamoring about Corpse Explosion, the skill, very specifically when you use Blighted Corpse Explosion to turn it into a darkness skill that does shadow damage. Right now my skill damage does 264, you'll see that it's listed as shadow damage. Let's go ahead and go into my Paragon system and remove our Darkness glyph that gives me an additional 81.3% shadow damage. We should see a pretty marked decrease in our overall damage for Corpse Explosion. I'll go ahead and remove that and go on back up to here, and it still says 264 damage. Now let me go ahead and put it back in just to show you that there's nothing up my sleeves here. We go back in, we go back to the Paragon, we go back to Darkness, we slot that right back in, and still says 264 damage. Now, I cannot stress this enough, just reading a tooltip and believing it is one of the worst things that you can do in any video game, and most notably in Diablo games, because the tooltip doesn't always represent the facts of the world. That's mostly why we're making this video right now. But this is just actually a segue. It's mostly that Corpse Explosion really doesn't seem to be working the way that it's intended, especially when you make it a darkness skill. And this is most notable with Crippling Darkness and other lucky hit abilities. I have been plagued with comments in my videos, references on Reddit, being pinged and DM'd in Discord, saying that Crippling Darkness does not trigger off of Blighted Corpse Explosion, that it doesn't work at all. And just real quick, here's some video evidence that it completely does. That monster was just stunned. Now what that footage doesn't show you is the amount of time it took to trigger that stun ability. Because not only have been people reporting that Crippling Darkness doesn't work with this skill, but they've also been reporting that the Ring of Mendeln doesn't work with this skill, so they're never getting the big procs on all of their minions, which I don't have video footage of that, but I have proven that that does work, but again, at a disturbingly low amount of the time. And it turns out that if you read one lucky hit ability and assume that that's how all lucky hit abilities work, you get a very incomplete understanding of how the lucky hit system works in general. And the main culprit here is Hewed Flesh. Hewed Flesh is one of the easiest lucky hit abilities to watch happen. You do some damage and 12% of the time you get a corpse out of it. On top of that, on bosses, it's doubled, so it's a 24% chance of the time. And if you go cast Corpse Explosion a ton of times on a single boss monster, you can effectively permanently cast. You basically never have to take your finger off of the trigger. You can just spam it continuously. And in fact, that's exactly what we used to test the difference between this lucky hit ability and this lucky hit ability. Just for a little more context, this is the character that we used to do our testing. We went to World Tier 1 Alderwood and we went and used the Den Mother as our target. We continued to wear armor because I thought that even on World Tier 1, if I just sat there completely naked, there was a chance that she would kill me. There wasn't, but that's why you see us wearing this here. It doesn't give any stats that are relevant to our testing. And then I used an incredibly low damage weapon so that we wouldn't kill her, so I could farm her for more and more data. And just to show you, we don't have any lucky hit chance bonus. So the raw lucky hit that we're working with is Corpse Explosion's base lucky hit chance, which is 40% of the time. Now you may be asking yourself, how do damage over time abilities even apply lucky hit? It gets a little bit complicated. We sat there triggering Hewed Flesh off of Corpse Explosion on the Den Mother. We were trying to track two things. One, how often a corpse was made underneath her feet, and two, how often we were applying Stagger, which would be our measurement for how often Crippling Darkness was being applied. You will see that sometimes we failed to generate a corpse per cast, so we had to use Reap to generate a corpse instead. I specifically tracked this as well, the difference in corpses via Hewed Flesh versus corpses manually generated. And then in addition to that, I verified that Stagger was never triggered off of Reap. Since it is a darkness skill, it could have applied Crippling Darkness, but luckily its lucky hit chance is very low and the Crippling Darkness chance is very low, so that never happened. And let me just tell you, re-watching a 5-minute clip of me very slowly counting corpses over and over again to make sure I didn't miss any data points was super fun, and I would definitely recommend it for everybody. This definitely isn't sarcasm. So now that I'm back in my natural habitat with a sheet of data behind me, let's go ahead and show you what the numbers were based off of our testing. So first and foremost, there were a total of 50 corpse generating instances during this fight, 8 of which were from Reap and 42 of which were from Hewed Flesh procking. In addition to that, we only had 3 instances of applying Stagger to the boss. The things that you need to understand is that every single time you cast Corpse Explosion, there are 12 instances of damage. So while it deals its damage over 6 seconds, it is twice per second. So that means that per Corpse Explosion, there were 12 instances of damage, meaning that there were a total of 600 Corpse Explosion tick damage incidents over which any one of these lucky hit abilities could have procced. So if we have our Corpse Explosion lucky hit chance here of 40%, no lucky hit bonus, Hewed Flesh's base chance to proc, which is 12%, and then doubled against a boss is 24%, and Crippling Darkness has a 15% chance to proc. If we were to take these numbers and assume that all lucky hit skills are equivalent, that they work the same, that you take the lucky hit chance of the skill and multiply it by the lucky hit chance of the ability, then Hewed Flesh should be triggering 1.6 times as often as Crippling Darkness. But if you were to take the amount of times that we triggered Hewed Flesh against the total number of damage ticks and then turn it back into a percentage, then 7% of the time we generated a corpse with Corpse Explosion off Hewed Flesh off of a boss. Against that, Crippling Darkness only triggered 0.5% of the time. So while it should only be 1.6 times as often to happen, Hewed Flesh triggered 14 times as often as Crippling Darkness did against the boss. Now, which one of these skills is the broken one? Is it the Crippling Darkness or is it the Hewed Flesh? Well, I think it comes down to the verbiage of the skills and why whenever you cast Corpse Explosion you get such a better return on corpse generation than you do on triggering any other lucky hit abilities. Hewed Flesh says that your damage, your actual damage, has up to a 12% chance to trigger generating a corpse, and this is doubled against a boss. Whereas Crippling Darkness says that the Darkness skill has up to a 15% chance to apply a stun. Ring of Mendelm likewise doesn't reference the damage that you deal, but instead just says up to a 10% chance to empower all minions. So this is very similar to the verbiage in Crippling Darkness, where Crippling Darkness is just indicating a skill type, but it says up to a 15% chance to stun if the skill is Darkness. And this says up to a 10% chance without a restriction on skill type. So if all lucky hit was equal, there is something broken here. If we were to just assume that the chance to proc is just that damage is being dealt, then we would have assumed that over 600 instances of damage, we would have created roughly 144 corpses. So obviously that also didn't happen. Well, if we take that same number, we take just the 600 instances of damage multiplied by the chance to generate a corpse, and then we multiply that by the lucky hit chance of Corpse Explosion, assuming that it reads the same lucky hit chance per instance of damage, we would have assumed to generate 57 corpses, which is getting a bit closer to how many we did actually generate based off of how many damage instances that we had. But if we do that same math, where we just take the 600 damage instances, multiply by the chance to proc Darkness, and then assume that you get the full lucky hit chance off of Corpse Explosion itself, we would have assumed to have applied Stagger around 36 times, and that clearly didn't happen. Is there anything else that we could possibly look at to see this type of interaction, where a skill is gaining a tag that otherwise normally wouldn't have, and is then interacting with other passives and skills? Well, luckily there is, and it's Ultimate Shadow. The Ultimate Shadow aspect actually takes your Bone Storm and Blood Wave skills and adds the Darkness tag without replacing. So rather than they become Darkness skills, they are also considered Darkness skills. So if you look at my Bone Storm here, while it still has the Bone tag, it also has the Darkness tag. And this allows it to trigger things like Reaper's Pursuit and Crippling Darkness. And while I've lost the footage at this point, we also sat there testing with Bone Storm, seeing how long it would take for it to proc Lucky Hit, apply stun via Crippling Darkness, And sadly, it is incredibly similar to how Corpse Explosion works, where I sat there for, what was it, 6 full-length casts of the skill, where I also had on Bone Storm consumes corpses to be able to increase its length. So these were 18-second long Bone Storms, and on the 6th cast, I saw a single proc of stun up against one of the monsters that were within range. One of the few things that we can take away from this is that lucky hit abilities on damage over time area of effects are not applying their full lucky hit per instance of damage when the lucky hit doesn't indicate that it's per instance of damage. And I know that's a little bit weird, but stick with me here. When the lucky hit just tells you that there is a chance of a thing occurring, even if it has a restriction like darkness skills or blood skills or whatever, damage over time is getting some type of prorated lucky hit chance per damage instance. When the lucky hit ability specifically refers to damage instances, the chance to proc seems to be a lot higher than it really should be, and it might be applying the full lucky hit coefficient. It gets even weirder when you look at something like Abhorrent Decrepify. The verbiage here relates to when an enemy is hit. If you were to read the bonus lucky hit tooltip, it says that increases the chance of triggering lucky hit effects when your skills deal damage. The problem with Abhorrent Decrepify is that since it specifically relates to when an enemy is hit that has Decrepify applied to it, you're able to trigger lucky hit off of things like the thorns on your Necromancer summons, which is not considered you dealing damage because that never triggers Hewed Flesh, and thorns is not considered to be one of your skills because it doesn't typically proc things that say when your skills do things, except it does increase its damage based off of your core stat, which typically only increases your skill damage, but that's a whole other can of worms. And this lucky hit ability clearly isn't looking at a lucky hit coefficient from a skill because Thorns doesn't have a lucky hit coefficient for it to be reading. And your skeletons do not normally proc lucky hit. If you were to sit there with any lucky hit ability on your gear and just wait, your skeletons hitting a monster will literally never trigger lucky hit. And if you've ever seen them triggering stuff like cooldown reduction from Decrepify, it was almost certainly because you had Thorns on your gear and they were inheriting 30% of that. So all in all, that's basically what I have from you, from all of the testing that we have. Yes, Crippling Darkness is triggering off of darkness skills in general. Yes, it's triggering off of Corpse Explosion, and yes, it's triggering off of things like Darkness, Bone Storm, and Blood Wave. The chance for it to proc is incredibly small because it appears as if we're getting a prorated value for our lucky hit chance on any damage over time abilities, and these percentages are less than 1% unless you have a significant amount of bonus lucky hit on your character. Lastly, Hewed Flesh and Abhorrent Decrepify are exceptions to the rule. These are things that have specific caveats about other triggering events, either your damage or just the monster being hit, that do not relate directly to the skill being used, so trying to calculate how often they are supposed to proc gets incredibly difficult. But what we can say definitively is that Hewed Flesh is definitely proccing a whole lot more than other lucky hit abilities. And all in all, while I promise you if you were to stack a ton of additional lucky hit onto your gear, you'll start seeing Crippling Darkness trigger a whole lot more. The problem with that being that skills should appear to work or should be functional at a base level when you put a skill point into it. I have been basing the vast majority of my essence generation and mana battery tutorials and education around the fact that something like the Umbral Ring, when you apply crowd control effect, nets you additional essence. And I've been personally telling people, so you change Corpse Explosion over to Blighted Corpse Explosion, then use Crippling Darkness for a better mana battery. And it has been true, that does happen, but the chance of it happening is so low that players at lower levels that don't just have like inherent extra lucky hit on their gear because they don't have the vast majority of endgame gear, think that these abilities literally don't work, which is a completely logical conclusion to come from unless you sit there and video record yourself for 5 minutes straight, looking at monsters, waiting to see a stun animation go off. I wanted to give this all to you. I hope that this helps in some way. I hope this explains some of the things that you've been seeing. If you have more data, more testing, more things that you've worked on that you can prove and show, I would love for you to hit me up. Either join us in the Discord, leave a comment here, hell, hit me up on Reddit, hit me up somewhere. and get that information to us so that we can help to continue to educate people about these incredibly weird and nuanced systems that for whatever reason are like pulling teeth trying to get them to do the things that they say that they do. But again, thank you so much for watching this video. I look forward to seeing you in the next one.